We are living in unprecedented times, are we not? We have science, for example, that has supposed to have improved our lives in many different ways. We have medicines and pharmaceuticals that also have supposed to have improved our lives in many ways. And in the last couple of years, we've seen something rolled out across the nation and across the whole world as the answer to a major problem that occurred in and from March 2020, although in other countries it was a little bit earlier, in which we had to lock down to protect ourselves. And we, as a country and as a society and as a body of people, look to the government and the governments around the world and these think tanks of unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats who came up with a solution that we ought to follow. And the governments at some point even mandated this solution, a sort of medical intervention, if you like, for pretty much as all the population. There were some people who resisted, who thought that this was a nonsense, but on the whole, a lot of people followed the government advice. And this has occurred across the world. And yet we find that this situation has happened in the past and has not been as good as perhaps it should have been. And history has been ignored. And I'm very indebted to one of my viewers who sent me a little book, which I want to share some of it with you now. This is a book here, and it's called, as you can see, hopefully, the title. I'm just going to use the words "you know what" for that title, because of the terms and conditions on YouTube make it very difficult to use certain phrases of the English language. But anyway, you know what proved useless and dangerous. Notice it didn't say safe and effective, which is a particular interesting turn of phrase for a similar thing that we've seen recently. Anyway, it goes on. It says from 45 years, this you know what proved useless and dangerous from 45 years of registration statistics by a gentleman called Alfred R. Wallace. So let's have a look and see what he says, because I think you'll find this quite remarkable. So here we are. This is to members of Parliament. So this has been given to Parliament. And so they ought to know. So some 100 and whatever it is, 30, 40 years later, you would think. This was issued in 1889. So here we go. Now let's just see if we can read some of this. Let me just get that a bit better on the screen. So 45 years of registration statistics. Let's bring that up so we can see it. And he says here, this is for smallpox mortality and you know what. Having been led to inquire for myself as to the effects of you know what in preventing and diminishing smallpox, I've arrived at results as unexpected as they appear to me to be conclusive. The question is one which affects our personal liberty as well as the health and even the lives of thousands. It therefore becomes a duty to endeavour to make the truth known to all, and especially to those on the faith of false or misleading statements have enforced the practice of you know what by penal laws. I propose now to establish the following 4 statements of fact by means of the only official statistics which are available. So and we'll look at those in a second. But like many people, looking at the facts that have been released, like the figures of the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, and makes a case based on the government's own statistics to say, hang on a second, the present situation that we're in seems to be urgent enough to elicit conversation in government and debate from both houses, and yet it doesn't. And we then see a number of people being affected by you know what, which was rolled out not only across this country and others, but a whole globe, and yet still nobody wants to talk about it. And MPs in particular are happy to dispel any questioning and saying, no, it's safe and effective, dancing about by singing the same hymn sheet that the government is, despite many people, and I know this to be a fact, many of my viewers having written to their MP, sharing those MP letters and the responses back. So this might be something worth sharing with MPs as well, and I'll leave the link in the description. And maybe you could highlight certain bits or take certain bits of this, because this was from the 1850s. So let's have a look and see what he is trying to prove to be true, and his conclusion on this. So using only the official statistics, he says, I shall adopt a mode of presenting those statistics as a whole, which will render them intelligent to all. And the statements he aims to prove are: 1. During the 45 years of registration of deaths and their causes, smallpox mortality has very slightly diminished, while an exceedingly severe smallpox epidemic occurred within the last 12 years of the period. Sound familiar? There is no evidence to show that the slight decrease of smallpox mortality is due to the you-know-what, and that the severity of smallpox as a disease has not been mitigated by the you-know-what. And finally, the several inoculable diseases have increased. I'll read that again. That several inoculable diseases have increased due to an alarming extent, coincidentally with the enforced you-know-what. And so we have seen, have we not, that during the disease that happened in 2020 seems to have got worse and worse on certain people after they took a certain you-know-what, which seems to have lowered their immune system. So anyway, the book goes on and he discusses all of this. And I want to go now to, I believe it's page 24 on my screen here, to his conclusions, using something which you may be familiar if you've watched certain podcasters, video people. Dr. John Campbell, for example, would be a classic example of this, using, let's go to the screen, the annual deaths to see what that tells us. I'm just going to increase this so we can read it a bit more clearly. Here we go. So, annual deaths in England per million, and it gives these dates from 1850 to 1880s. So, smallpox, this is the you-know-what that was given to people who had smallpox and those that didn't have it as a precaution. So here we go. In 1850, the 279 per million people died in England. Beyond that, it goes to 199, 191, and so on, and it lowers right down into the 1880 that 25 people per million unfortunately died. So that's, it looks good that them having the you-know-what seems to work. However, peculiarly, syphilis, a word that's difficult to say on YouTube, that rhymes with prancer, and I don't know what this one is, tabs, mesenteria, whatever that is anyway, and these other ones, premier and skin disease, these probably have different names now, I imagine, I'm not sure, or maybe they don't, but anyway, have a look at the figures there, because those death figures are rising rather dramatically. So the word that rhymes with prancer is 302 deaths per million in 1850. But by the time you get to 1880, 30 years later, it has almost doubled. It's 516. These other diseases are also, and overall, you've got the totals here, total deaths from all of these conditions is about 636 in 1850. By the time you get to 1880, 30 years later, it's 900. So it's a third more are dying mysteriously. And so here we've got this last bit, this progressive increase that shows the increase in deaths over the years, and nothing seems to be stopping it. And his conclusion here is worth reading because it may send a chill down your throat, or your spine even, as you start to think, hang on a minute, this is all so familiar. It says here, we see a constant increase in the mortality from each of these diseases, an increase which in the sum of them is steady and continuous. It is true that we have not and cannot have direct proof that you-know-what is the sole cause of this increase, but we have good reason to believe that it is the chief cause. In the first place, it is a vera causa since it directly inoculates infants and adults on an enormous scale with whatever blood disease may exist unsuspected in the system of the infants from whom the you-know-what virus is taken. In the next place, no other adequate cause has been adduced for the remarkably continuous increase of these special diseases, which the spread of sanitation, of cleanness, and of advanced medical knowledge should have rendered both less frequent and less fatal. And finally, I just want to leave you with this last bit. The increased deaths from these 5 causes from 1855 to 1880 exceed the total deaths from smallpox during the same period. Does that not ring a bell with the last few years? So that even if the latter disease had been totally abolished by you-know-what, the general mortality would have been increased, and there is much reason to believe that the increase may have been caused by the you-know-what itself. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that... I mean, this is a report that was given to the government 30-something years ago. We went through a mass medical intervention. And this stuff has been known. The fact that the body's own immune system has been tampered with, and that this process that we've been given and all the evidence now that is leaking out from various different places, and yet the government still will not talk about it. They can't because it seems to me they are complicit to a process that has caused the death and the injury and the harm to millions of people. And yet they should have known, and they would have known. And this, I think, should be sending a chill down everybody's spine that years ago this knowledge was known and had been suppressed. I'd be interested in your thoughts and comments on this. And I'll leave the link, and maybe it is an idea to send something like this to MPs and say, come on, we know you knew. Why didn't you prevent it?